We begin our story today with Herod. King Herod of Judea was king for about 40 years in the land of what we would now call Israel. He ruled for the time period before and during Jesus' birth. From one perspective, Herod was a good king. He had the trust of Julius Caesar, the Roman emperor. And so while technically Judea was part of the Roman Empire, Herod was allowed to rule as a king with a lot of autonomy. He treated his people well most of the time. He was known for lowering taxes during hard economic times. There's one story that during a famine, he had his own gold plate melted down so he could buy food for starving people. There were numerous building projects during his tenure, including a complete renovation of the Jewish temple, something that the people would have really loved. He ruled so well, partly because he had no competition. Which brings me to my second point about Herod. He was a terrible, murderous person, downright evil in many ways. Good morning, I'm Pastor Tully, here with my Wednesday morning message. This month, we're going to be talking about 4 stories from the Christmas narratives in the Gospels. Our scripture today is from Matthew chapter 2, verses 13 through 18, and it's the story of how Jesus was a refugee in Egypt. This passage is one that us pastors, we'd love to just skip it at Christmas time. There's not a lot of good news in these verses, and it's a really difficult passage to preach on, especially during the season of goodwill towards all and peace on earth. There's 2 arcs to this story that we need to understand. The first is that King Herod, he was threatened by the birth of baby Jesus. He was threatened by this baby that had been prophesied, and so he decides to just eliminate all the babies in Bethlehem. Now, some of you might be thinking that this is just unbelievable, or that this was not the kind of thing that a king could get away with. Well, to set the record straight, Herod was a terrible person. He was known for being insanely jealous and suspicious of anyone who wanted to take power. He murdered one of his own wives and her mother. He had 3 of his own sons assassinated just so they couldn't take his throne. There's this one story from before he died where he had like 300 of the most well-respected people in his kingdom arrested and then gave instructions that when he died, they should all be executed so that none of them could take power. Herod was awful. And knowing all of this history makes the slaughter of the innocents passage seem much more believable. Now, scholars, they think that Bethlehem wasn't that big of a town, and so best estimates, we're talking about 20 to 30 babies. This was a small-scale event that took place by a few soldiers over a couple of days, and it by no means makes what Herod did any less evil. It just means that this was not some world-shattering event for the whole kingdom. Most folks in the kingdom wouldn't have known about it. Bethlehem was kind of a small city about a day's walk away from the big city of Jerusalem. People would have talked about it for sure, but this is not the kind of thing that everyone would have known about. The second arc to our story is that God speaks to Joseph again and warns him. And so then he and Mary and baby Jesus, they get up in the middle of the night and they flee. They run for their lives, literally. Well, at least the life of baby Jesus. They leave their family and their friends. They leave their work and their livelihood, and they run away to Egypt. Now, there's a lot of symbolism here in this story that's important. This is not the first time in the Bible when a king tried to kill a bunch of babies. That happened back in Exodus with baby Moses. And of course, that draws a connection between Jesus and Moses. And Jesus fleeing to Egypt makes that connection even stronger because Egypt is where Moses lived and did his thing. Moses was the great liberator of his people, setting them free from slavery. And Jesus is the great liberator of all people, setting us free from sin. So I think it's important, especially this time of year, to remember this story, to remember that Jesus was a refugee, that he lived under threat of death from the time he was born up until the time he hung on a cross. When we think about helping the less fortunate, when we think about people in need, when we think about charitable giving this time of year, let us not forget the refugees, the people who have fled for their lives, and the organizations that support them and help them get resettled. Next week, we'll be talking about the wise men from the East. I hope to see you then. Take care.